Jeff Bowman and Frank Rack, welcome to the program. Frank, I got to tell you, I love your background image there. So tell us, are you live from?
No, this is an image of Tulik Field Station up in Alaska.
Yeah, so it's beautiful. Jeff Bowman, let me just start with you. Tell us a little bit about the Arctic. Give us kind of a broad sense as to what this region really represents besides being cold. What else should we know? What else should our audience really know about the Arctic, just broadly?
Sure, Paul. So the main thing that I would really like to convey about the Arctic is the dynamic nature of this environment. And I've been fortunate to work up there on a number of occasions, but this is the longest period of time that I've spent in the Arctic, and I was surprised at how dynamic that environment is. So we have this mental picture of the Arctic as being a fairly static place during the wintertime. It's cold, it's locked in ice, not a lot is happening, not a lot of things are moving around. And that is absolutely not the case. That ice is drifting, it's being impacted by the winds and the ocean currents, and it's in this constant state of movement and readjustment, and that has really strong implications for a lot of the geochemical processes that we were focused on in MOSAiC.
So then talk a little bit about MOSAiC and maybe give us the acronym is an important one too. Maybe start there and tell us a little bit about the team. Tell us about the leadership, the various scientists that were all brought together. Frank, I promise we're gonna get to you too. But I think what's important too is to maybe set the tone for the role that the National Science Foundation played. Besides funding, there are some bigger pieces here too.
Yeah, absolutely. So the acronym is always a little bit of a tricky one, and you're gonna trip me up on this one, I can tell. But it approximates to the Multidisciplinary Observatory for the Study of Arctic Climate. And I apologize, you'll have to prompt me again on the second half of that question there.
Well, I'm curious about the composition of the team because this was multidisciplinary, and what does that mean? Were there ecologists? Were there physicists? Were there just a big wide range of scientific participation, and then maybe even some of the leadership and how the team was brought together?
Yeah, so the best way to think about MOSAiC is as a coupled study between the ocean, ice, and the atmosphere. Very often in the past, just because of the way that the scientific domains are organized and the logistics of doing these things, very typically you study one of those domains, maybe two of those domains, and you study the interactions between them. But we know that that's not looking at the complete story for how the Arctic works. And so what we try to do in MOSAiC is really bring together an investigation team that has expertise in each of those domains. We have oceanographers and ecologists that are looking at the water column. We've got sea ice physicists and sea ice biologists that are looking at the ice, and then we have atmospheric scientists that are looking at the atmosphere. And all three of those groups are talking to each other and exchanging information, and very often actually designing experiments that are explicitly looking at exchanges between those three domains. That gives us a much more comprehensive picture of how the Arctic functions and how it might function in the future.
And so what was the reasoning behind getting actually frozen there on the ice? What does that tell you? What kind of picture does that really develop for us?
Yeah, so that's driven a little bit by the logistical constraints of how one does this. There's no land mass in the central Arctic that you can establish a base on to make long-term observations. So really the only way to do it is to establish a base in the drifting pack ice and drift with that ice. So icebreakers provide a really powerful opportunity to do that because it provides you a shelter and a structure and a laboratory that you can use throughout the year. So to place the ship in the ice, allow it to freeze in and allow it to drift naturally with that ice is really the only way that you can put all of this infrastructure in place to do these types of observations throughout an entire annual cycle.
So as opposed to Antarctica, where you could literally put a base of operations, more of a permanent base, you really can't do this. So what's the idea then? Do you just kind of just cut the engines and just drift?
Well, that was the original idea, is exactly that. I mean, it's slightly more complicated because the engines are what's providing the power, but essentially the ship is maintained it's tethered to the ice, it's moored to the ice, and it drifts with the ice. In practice, it turned out to be a little bit more challenging than that, and that gets back to what I said earlier about the Arctic being far more dynamic in the winter than most people appreciate. So you can imagine the ship is at the edge of an ice flow that had persisted from the previous year, and new ice had formed around it. So even after they had ices formed, there are still fracture points and boundaries around that original flow. And as the pack ice is releasing energy and shifting all throughout the wintertime, those fractures are opening and reclosing. So it turns out that the ship ended up being in a place of a fairly high degree of energy, and was impacted by quite a lot of energy in the pack. And so the ship actually had to actively work to maintain its position at the edge of the flow. Ultimately, because of the speed of the drift and because of the challenges with COVID-19, the ship ended up leaving the ice for a brief period of time to effect a crew exchange. And that was not planned in the original logistical planning. But the basic idea still stands. You put the ship in the ice, you essentially cut the engines, you tether the ship to the ice, and it stays with the same ice flow as that ice flow drifts across the Arctic as part of the pack.
And I'm assuming that the drift is either accelerated by the environment and some of the warm weather and perhaps climate change. And so why is it that the Arctic is considered this epicenter for some of your study and work on global warming and climate change? What is it about that area that makes it so important to study?
Yeah, so there are a number of reasons that it's really important, and the atmospheric scientists can speak to this far better than I can. My expertise is in biological oceanography, but I will point to a couple of things that they have relayed to me. And one is simply the huge unknown of the Arctic, because it is so difficult to study the central Arctic, and particularly throughout the entire annual cycle, unlike, for example, the Antarctic, where you have those research stations. We simply have less data about this part of the world, and so it's a big unknown. However, we do have this process called Arctic amplification. Places that have a really high reflective surface, such as sea ice, play an outsized role in the Earth's energy budget, because they're very good at reflecting solar radiation back to space. So as we change the state of the sea ice, and we reduce that sea ice cover and extent, and we replace it with dark water, there's a big role that the Arctic plays in terms of the Earth's energy budget. And this drives a lot of the other processes that we're studying in terms of energy budgets in the atmosphere as well as in the ocean. So I'd point to those two factors. There are some actual physical changes to the sea ice itself that make the Arctic particularly interesting as well. And again, this plays back into this idea of the Arctic being a very dynamic place. We know that the sea ice is getting thinner. It's getting overall younger in the Arctic, and it's getting thinner than it was just a couple of decades ago. This makes it a little bit more prone to deformation. It's thought to perhaps be what we call rougher, so it has more ridges and more keels down into the water. This makes it a more effective transmitter of energy from the atmosphere down into the water. So you can imagine wind blowing across the surface of the sea ice. If you have a relatively flat and relatively thick and heavy pack ice, then it's going to be relatively difficult for the wind to move that pack ice and for that pack ice to transmit energy down into the water column. But as that ice gets thinner and gets a little bit lighter and also gets more ridges, it gets rougher, it catches that wind more effectively, transmits that energy down into the water column, and that has huge implications for the biology and for other processes that are taking place in the water column. And that's exactly what we're seeing on MOSAiC this year.
Thank you for that. Frank Rack, I certainly don't mean to leave you there all by your lonesome, and I want to bring you in too. So maybe tell us a little bit about your goals for the MOSAiC expedition and your scientific course of study there.
Yeah, so my role is really to support the scientists that NSF has funded. This project has been in the planning stage for more than a decade, and it involves both international and interagency contributions. In addition to the central observatory or the icebreaker itself, there's a distributed network of sensors and instruments that go out 30 kilometers in all directions. So there are buoys, there are towers on the ice, and there are deployments of drones, balloons, radiosondes that go up through the atmosphere. There are nets that go down through the ice and collect samples in the water column. They're doing measurements of conductivity, temperature, and pressure. So it's really this integrated study throughout the wintertime. It's a time when we have very little direct data collection. So it's really the benefit is this time series approach that allows you to observe storm systems moving through, and all the things that you'd really like to be able to measure but haven't had the opportunity in the past.
So tell us a little bit about the planning. How long did it take to make arrangements for all this to come together, and what about even some of the interaction between the various scientists? And as Jeff points out, there were different parties involved. So how do you keep everybody kind of working together in an environment like this?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of meetings, planning meetings that go back to 2011. They've developed a science plan with each discipline contributing to the goals of that plan and the measurements that would be made. There's also been an implementation plan. The Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany early on committed the Polarstern, the central icebreaker for the observatory. And then we basically took proposals from individual scientists in the US and other agencies in other countries to develop specific plans. What instruments, what do they want to measure? And so we've really been facilitating the interactions between these groups of scientists, the discussions they've had, so that they could do a very robust job of planning. And then there's all the logistics in terms of freight, getting things to and from the vessel, making exchanges. The original plan had icebreakers rendezvousing with the vessel, and we've had several of those. But there were also aircraft that were flying out to the ship and back, and some of those got disrupted by COVID-19 restrictions that had to change the plan. So it's been this very dynamic, evolving tapestry of logistics and science coming together.
I read in my research too about the just the largest predator there in the Arctic, the polar bear. How did you deal with some of the vagaries presented by just some of the indigenous species that you were encountering?
Yeah, so we provided a lot of training for scientists before they went to the ship. There are also physical sensing devices. So we had a tripwire that was implemented around the vessel. There were bear guards with both non-lethal and forms of scaring away polar bears, as well as people with rifles in case it came to that. But there was very well thought out system to ensure safety and to provide the participants with the skills for working on the sea ice and ensuring their safety at various distances from the vessel, whether they're being transported by helicopter or walking or skiing to different locations.
Any incidents with the polar bears that you can tell us about? Did you guys have any real big encounters?
I'll let Jeff answer that.
So I got the really quiet leg. During leg 3, I believe there was only one approach of a polar bear to Polarstern. Their activity seems to be quite reduced in the central Arctic during the wintertime. They're closer to the ice edge, closer to land, where they have a better chance of finding food. As we've moved into the spring and summer period, I understand that activity has ramped up a little bit, and certainly legs 1 and 2 had a little bit more in terms of encounters. I think that was entirely expected, and it was certainly within the bounds of what was expected. But they're certainly out there, and as the teams move deeper into the summer period, I think think that the encounter rate will certainly increase a little bit and keep them on their toes.
Jeff, I have to say this sounds, of course, the scientific aspect of it is very real and important, but it almost sounds as though it's as much adventure as anything else. Did you look at it that way as you were on this big kind of grand adventure there?
Certainly. I actually felt a tinge of jealousy for the graduate students on there, and I guess I get to still call myself a little bit of a young scientist, but if I was a younger scientist, I think I would have captured a little bit of that spirit a little bit better. I've got young kids and more kind of domestic responsibilities now than I had when I was younger, and so it becomes a little bit harder to just sit back and enjoy the grand adventure aspect of it. But there was certainly a strong element of that. You're doing something that has never been done before, employing techniques that have never been employed in this part of the world. It's absolutely a fantastic undertaking to be part of.
So what did you both learn then? Scientifically, where can we kind of put some of the information gathering and then maybe tell us how we can even apply some of that in the future?
Sure. So that's a really interesting question because it scales very differently across the different domains that are investigating MOSAiC. So my own expertise is in DNA sequence analysis of phytoplankton and bacteria that are living in the water column as well as in the sea ice. That type of data takes us many months to develop. So we actually won't have our samples to work on until the expedition completes in October. We'll bring those samples back to our laboratory. We will extract the nucleic acids out of those samples. We'll send them off for sequencing, and then we'll be working using various data analysis tools. We'll be working with that data for some time before we have real answers in terms of who is out there at different times of the year and what their kind of ecological functions are. That's very different from other teams that are getting very nearly real-time data, in some cases exactly real-time data in terms of the processes that they are trying to study. So from talking to those colleagues, again, I would point to that concept of a very dynamic Arctic. There's evidence of a greater degree of energy transmission into the upper water column from wind than we had anticipated. For example, when there's a storm, that wind speed seems to translate fairly quickly into what we call a deeper mixed layer in the ocean. So you actually see the vertical movement of water through the sea ice happening as a result of that increased wind. We know that has profound implications for the biology, but we won't actually get to answer those questions from a biological standpoint for some time to come.
Does that wind impact the jet stream? Is that where some of this research is even pointing to, that you want to look at the impacts across the whole Earth, across for all of us?
Certainly, there are definitely broad implications. How the jet stream plays into it, I think, is well outside of my realm, so I'll leave that for the atmospheric scientists to kind of discuss. Certainly, there are larger global climate phenomena that are playing out in the Arctic and vice versa. On our end, we're very interested in things like the amount of carbon dioxide that's being taken up by the biological communities in the water column, and also the amount of carbon dioxide that they are releasing. So as you go through this annual cycle, you go through periods of time that we call net heterotrophic versus net autotrophic. And that basically means periods of time where they are giving off more CO2 than they're taking off, and periods of time where they are taking out more CO2 than they're giving off. And so we're trying to understand that balance between those two processes to understand whether the Arctic as a whole is likely to become more or less a contributor to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as we move forward into the future.
And Frank, how about you? What did you learn?
Yeah, I think the importance or one of the real significance of this expedition is the international collaboration and cooperation, as well as here in the US, the interagency discussions that we've had. In addition to the National Science Foundation's investment, there was a significant contribution from the Department of Energy, from NASA, from NOAA, and they've all contributed instruments and scientists to this expedition. In terms of the international collaboration, we really worked in partnership with the Alfred Wegener Institute and other countries who were supplying instruments and personnel. And it really taught you that you have to really communicate well, do detailed planning, and understand the challenges that others are facing. I mean, with this expedition, you're staying throughout the Arctic winter, so it's complete darkness, it's very cold, it's windy, but you're still trying to get supplies and people back and forth. And then with COVID-19, you had that additional challenge that wasn't anticipated in the original plan, and we had to respond fairly agilely to ensure we could get our people over to Europe and then up into the Arctic to do these exchanges. So it became quite a bit more than what we anticipated early on.
As connected as we all are, how was the Wi-Fi there?
So that's a real challenge, and you know, we take these things for granted, even when we're doing scientific research in the Antarctic. If you're at one of the main bases down there, you've got decent internet connectivity. Here you are completely off the grid. There is some connection to the Iridium satellite network, so you can make kind of very low quality phone calls to home. It's quite tedious to do that. The main technological innovation that really helped us was the ability to use WhatsApp, the messaging platform. You can actually set that up on a server over an Iridium connection. And that's turned out to be a fairly key way of having a nearly instantaneous communication with our family members, but also our team members back home to help us troubleshoot instruments and exchange ideas. But beyond that, and beyond kind of a very slow email connection, there's no access to internet. So there's no, you know, standard exchange of communication, standard exchanges of data as we come to typically appreciate them.
Yeah. And families appreciate them a great deal. So final question for you both then, Frank and Jeff. Are we going to be able to do this again? Is this just a once in a lifetime kind of thing with all of the ice, the sea ice change there?
So I'll take a stab at it first, and then Frank can. I think it's imperative that we start to treat this more as a decadal observational program than as a one-off for a generational opportunity. Elsewhere in the world, we have what we call hydrographic observing programs that attempt to observe key parts of the ocean on decadal scales at least. It's quite surprising that the Arctic, despite its incredibly rapid pace of change and its known importance in the global climate system, does not yet receive that level of attention. And there are, of course, good reasons for that. It's logistically very challenging to do. It's very costly to do. The number of icebreakers in the world that are capable of doing it are very, very limited. But it's imperative that the global scientific community come together and figure out how to do MOSAiC type efforts at least decadally.
I think that one of the things that is impacting this kind of science in the future is technology development and innovation. With this expedition, there was an experimental satellite called Kepler that was being used to provide data exchange. And we're going to see more of that in the future as low Earth orbit constellations, satellites come into play, and autonomous instrumentation like buoys that can be deployed and then transmit data throughout the winter become more common. So I think we're seeing a real sea change in opportunity here due to this advancement in technology and communication. So hopefully that will really improve our ability to make measurements in the Arctic throughout the year in the coming decades.
Thank you both. Thank you both for your time. Thank you for your hard work. We'd love to have you back and talk about some of the learning that's come from an expedition like this. But great job, guys, and really appreciate all your time.
Thank you, Paul. I'm happy to come back anytime.